The 5-Minute Photographer with Shelton Muller.
On the subject of depth of field, which is what we're talking about here, some photographs really don't require a lot of thought. Because they don't have a lot of depth necessarily, or perspective, the subject of depth of field is not really applicable. But it is in a lot of photographs. And what is depth of field? Depth of field is the difference between this and this. Or perhaps in more real and everyday photographic terms, the difference between this and this. And you can see immediately, just by these two photographs, the power that depth of field has in your photographs. It's guided by the apertures you select, the focal length of your lens, and your proximity to the subject, how close your camera and your lens are to your subject. Let's talk about the aperture for a moment. If in taking a photograph you were to select f/16, a small aperture, this would be what your photograph would look like. If in taking the same photograph you were to select f1.8, this would be what your photograph would look like. Let's have a look at that again. This photograph taken at f22 as against this photograph taken with the same lens at f2.8. When you place the pictures side by side, you can see the difference between them. It's a difference that can make or break your photograph. It's a difference that can highlight the subject in a way perhaps you've never quite considered and is all caught up in depth of field. In this photograph, we just used an 85mm 1.8 lens and focused on the eyes. And in this way, the model for the front cover was the subject without any distraction. Minimal depth of field is an excellent tool for highlighting the subject, removing your subject from distracting backgrounds, making sure that it stands out in a potentially distracting situation, or perhaps focusing on just one part or one aspect of the subject is very powerful. The great thing, of course, also about having a fast aperture lens is that in a situation where you need available light, where you can only work in available light, a fast aperture, minimal depth of field works to your advantage because you can work in low light situations. The second thing that your depth of field depends upon is the focal length of your lens. Often photographers will use very long lenses to minimize their depth of field, and this is particularly true of fashion and swimwear photography. In these particular photographs, a 200mm 2.8 lens was used so that the model stood out and the background was completely blurred. The reverse is true with wide-angle lenses. And of course, what we have here is a situation with a 35mm lens taken at 2.8 and the same photograph or the same situation taken with a 200mm lens at 2.8. And look at the difference between how the background was visibly rendered. For landscape photography, the situation is a little bit different. Landscape photographs usually call on the photographer to have more or a lot of depth of field. Depth of field that would give you sharpness from the foreground right through to the background of your image, so that the eye is transported through the image because everything is sharp right from the foreground through to the subject matter at the back. And for this, of course, smaller apertures are required. And often in landscape photography, something called hyperfocal distance is used. What is that? Well, it's not that hard, really. Simply select the smallest aperture on your lens, which is the highest f number, say in this case f22. And just as a rule of thumb, because this can get pretty technical, focus somewhere in about 1/3 from the bottom of your frame. Doing so will ensure that foreground to background in an image such as this is in focus. When selecting your aperture, of course, you also need to consider, or your depth of field, you need to consider proximity to subject. Let's look at these two pictures again. Both were taken with the same lens at the same f-stop setting, 2.8, and yet the closer you get to your subject, more visibly blurred the background is. Because this is true, of course, macro photography can be very difficult, and you naturally need to select smaller apertures to ensure that everything is in focus. And often on macro lenses such as this one, you have the choice of very small apertures indeed, apertures of, say, f22 or f32. Working at a small aperture, though, means a slow shutter speed, and you'll probably need flash. Depth of field is a vital force in your photography, and whether it is macro, landscape, or portrait, understanding it is the key, often, to dynamic images.